Welcome to the Ground Jewels. My name's James Dixon, and today we're talking about Brighton's AMEX Stadium. Now, Brighton Stadium is a ground jewel for me, not just because it's one of the better modern stadiums that we have, but the story of how the club got there. If you were a Brighton fan during the 90s, you basically experienced trauma. You lost your ground, the traditional ground for Brighton, the Goldstone Ground. You were nomadic for a while, and eventually you found your way to your new home. And not only when you get there is it home, you go on the greatest run in your club's history. Brighton are now in a regular fixture in the Premier League. It's their first season in Europe. And to discuss that, we've got the fantastic football author Chris Lee from the Outside Right podcast. He's written books on football and fascism and also about the origin stories of the beautiful game. He's a very intelligent chap, a very interesting chap, and he shared some great memories and reflections on Brighton, on the Amex, and of their journey to get there. And I think it's a really, really nice podcast. I have to apologise to Chris, though. He originally recorded this in October, and for a number of reasons, chiefly illness, it didn't go out when it was supposed to. You may pick up on some references to the upcoming Europa League group stage. You all know that's in the past, but that's fine. They're still in the competition. They've done well. They're in the knockout rounds now. You also might pick up some references to the ongoing Rugby World Cup, because we talked about that in the context of the AMEX Stadium hosting the fabulous Japan versus South Africa game from 2015. That's also fine. There's never a bad time to talk about the Rugby World Cup. Chris is a great guest, and we'll get to that as soon as we've covered off news from around the grounds this week. And I've got 3 stories that I want to share with you. Firstly, in New York, the architecture firm Populous, who behind some of the best stadiums in the world, have shared drawings and renderings of what their pop-up cricket stadium in New York is going to look like. We'll let them call it New York. It's actually not that close to New York, but this is where the one of the American venues for the T20 World Cup that's going to be happening in the early part of this summer. And it's going to be notable because India and Pakistan are going to be playing there. I'm not sure they've got enough seats. 34,000. I think it's going to be something interesting to watch and just to see how well America takes to cricket and how well this stadium can cope with a big clash like India versus Pakistan. So something to watch. There is news from Northern Ireland this week and the ongoing political battle over the Euro 2028 stadium, which is supposed to be Casement Park, which is an old, very dilapidated GAA ground in one of the nationalist areas. Unionist politicians are kicking up a big stink about the amount of money being spent. Of course, because it's in Northern Ireland, there are those community lines where the battle lines are drawn. I'm really worried about this one. It feels like when the politicians in Northern Ireland get involved, nothing happens. And that stadium needs a lot of work to be ready for a tournament in 4 years' time. And if it gets bogged down and, excuse the pun, becomes a political football, then Northern Ireland might not be part of the Great Britain and Ireland Euro 2028. Something to keep an eye on there. And finally, there's an interesting story coming out of Birmingham with Birchfield Harriers accusing Birmingham City Council of reneging on their lease agreement over the Alexander Stadium. So the Alexander Stadium was redeveloped for Birmingham's 2022 Commonwealth Games bid. The club, the athletics club there, say they had a 125-year lease on a peppercorn rent to access the facilities, and they're not being given the access that their lease demands. The Olympian Derek Redmond, who many of you remember from Barcelona in '92, and his dad and his leg and all that kind of thing, has got involved and has called out the council. So, and the club are suggesting they've lost a 6-figure sum in terms of lost training fees and lost memberships because of this ongoing row. So it would be really, real shame if the legacy of Birmingham's Commonwealth Games was to destroy the best athletics club in the city. So hopefully that's not what's happened there. If there are any more developments on that, I will keep you up to date. But now let's go and talk to Chris about Brighton. So this week on the Ground Jewels podcast, we are delighted to be joined by the author, blogger, podcaster, Chris Lee. Chris is the man behind the Outside Right podcast and blog and has written a couple of fantastic books, the latest being The Defiant, a history of football against fascism. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on. Really excited.
This particular ground, because I know whenever I say it's sort of a new ground, I definitely get a few grumbles. But I think this ground absolutely encapsulates what it means to be a ground jewel. And the ground that we're talking about is Brighton Hove Albion's AMEX Stadium. Why to you is this a ground jewel?
Well, firstly, it's amongst the modern stadia and the post-Taylor Report stadia. It's not identikit, so it's not like, you couldn't just sort of like shoehorn it into any old post-industrial city and they all look the same. It's got wonderful design to it, sits within a beautiful setting in the South Downs, and more than anything for me, it's the story behind it and how the club kind of was within minutes of dropping out of the league, and who knows what would have happened then, to bounce back, and now is in Europe. And is a regular fixture in the top half, or at least the middle of the Premier League table.
It is a true redemption story. We're talking about less than a generation from being, like, as you said, being within minutes of dropping out of the Football League to now rubbing shoulders. I think with Ajax, is it, who are in your group in the Europa League? That's quite a turnaround. Can you give us the potted history of that?
Yeah, well done. Just for a bit of a caveat, actually, I officially a lapsed Queen's Park Rangers supporter. I just happen to have gone to Brighton quite a lot because I grew up kind of near with it, within sort of like driving distance of it. So that's why I've kind of seen as much of Brighton as I have of QPR. So I will that with that duality in mind, because I know a lot of people say you should have one club and that's that. I kind of flip, to be honest. So with Brighton, I've personally been going since the Goldstone days, at least since the late 80s. I remember a match against Millwall, which was quite exciting. Goldstone is one of those classic grounds that was just ready to be kind of ripped up and started again with, really. Let's not romanticize how the state of some stadiums by the time that sort of late 80s, early 90s was around. It was quite dilapidated, but we had some memories of there, including incredible FA Cup replay. I remember on a midweek against Liverpool, a great Liverpool team, which was the championship. So we're talking about, like, Rush, Barnes, McMahon, that sort of era, Grobbelaar, that I think it was 1991, went to extra time, and I think Liverpool ended up winning 3-2 in the end, which was but that was a great memory of that ground. By the time the mid 90s came along, it was Brighton were muted to move. No ground was secure by the time it did close, which was the last game there was the 26th of April 1997. That was a critical 1-0 win against Doncaster Rovers. The last goal at the Goldstone is kind of like a photograph that you'll see in Brighton's lanes in the shop windows and things like that. It's sort of like iconic cultural moment. But I mean, that just kept them alive for a bit longer, because they then had to go to Hereford and get a result to save their league status, and they did that. They got a 1-1 draw, and that sort of equaliser, that late equaliser we sort of alluded to, kind of is played quite often at the pre-match, in the build-up, to the game at the Amex, and it's just to kind of keep everyone grounded and remember really how far the club has come. Really, it was very, very, very close to dropping into what was then the Vauxhall Conference. The plot was sold at Goldstone. It's now a retail park. Brighton was then sort of nomadic for quite a while. So the first 2 years of that nomadic period, between 97 99 was spent at Priestfield and Gillingham, which a 2004 Observer piece rated both Priestfield and where they ended up later with the Withdean as two of the four worst grounds in the country, as voted for by fans. So that kind of like helps illustrate the state of that. And to be honest with you, if you know anything about the logistics and the sort of geography of the southeast of England, the travel, the 74-mile journey by public
Yeah.
transport is not
It's
really
not quick.
It's not quick. So it'd be better to play like in a London ground or something like that, really, to be honest. But they were at Gillingham for 2 years, and then went to the Withdean, which is only kind of like in the outskirts of Brighton, like 2 miles north of the station or something. And it's an athletic stadium, actually, where Steve Ovett, who was a good middle distance 800 and the 1500, I think, meter runner in the 80s. He's got a statue down on the seafront there. It was his sort of his ground where he trained and everything. So it had that sort of feel of a lower league German sort of Regionalliga ground, you know, the sort of like stands around the edge and massive athletics track, which is kind of, I mean, fairly commonplace in mainland Europe, right? But we're not kind of used to that here. I don't think it's very popular to have athletics track between the spectators and the pitch here.
No, from what I remember, it came in for a lot of stick, particularly from the sort of visiting fans who were sort of squirreled away in a far corner away from most of the action.
Did you go yourself?
I never. Do you know what? It never called to me, the Withdean, in terms of. And when I managed to go to Milton Keynes when they were at the National Hockey Stadium, which I imagine has a similar of out of place vibe. But no, I never quite made it. Then there was a time when I was living in Surrey and I was working in Haywards Heath, so I would be in that area. But that came much later when the AMEX was up and running, and you do have to say you're completely right about the aspect. I remember driving down that way to somewhere maybe to Saltdean or somewhere that's a little bit east of Brighton, and I was driving past the University of Sussex, and I was completely sort of blown away, coming down through like the little lanes and be like, oh my god, this futuristic stadium has just appeared in this gorgeous landscape.
80s thing called fairy cakes, I think it was. They're kind of like wings on them, and it reminds me of that a little bit, because you see these two kind of just poking out the east and west stands. They're kind of like white kind of tubing, isn't it, almost, with the...
It's a little bit like whatever Huddersfield Stadium's called now, the McAlpine or the Galfarm, in architecture, but situated in a much nicer setting, really. Huddersfield one is basically next to Retails Park, and there's a really nice ice cream shop across from it. But yeah, apart from that unremarkable sort of setting. But sorry, I distracted you from talking to us about Steve Ovett and the Withdean Stadium.
The Withdean. Well, it's so classic. I mean, the thing is, the time at the Withdean coincided with me being kind of away and in London, and to be honest, they were lower league as well, so I didn't actually go to Withdean. I know I've got plenty of friends who did, including Palace fans, in fact, and I'm sure we'll come to that rivalry. And yeah, no one's got a particularly positive kind of vibes to think about it. This is interesting though. During that period, they were sponsored by a record label called Skint, which is quite an iconic shirt now to have that Skint kind of logo, because it kind of like sums up. I know it's the name of a record label, but at the same time, it sums up kind of the nature of how it felt, at least the club. They were not in their own ground at that point. But weirdly, conversely, they actually started improving. So yes, off the pitch it wasn't great, but on the pitch they came right back up to the second tier, now the Championship as it's called, after successive promotions. So that was 2002. So the AMEX was kind of like, Falmer was cited as a sort of potential location of the new ground quite early on. I think it's as early as the sort of late 90s or early 2000s. But plans were quite regularly opposed, because as you said, it's a very nice area. It's not in the national sort of park of the South Downs area of outstanding national beauty, but it is kind of on the edge of it.
It's as close as you can get without being sort of bound by the regulations of it, isn't it? It's
yeah.
I think I'd forgotten all the kind of I guess, hoo-ha really in terms of the planning application
Mm.
being called in by the government and looked at by like various secretaries of state, and it seems like a long and protracted process.
Yeah, it went right to the top.
Do you remember there being a debate over whether that was right at the time, or were people so keen just to I mean, obviously the Gillingham experience was
Mm.
difficult, and then the Withdean is not in a purpose-built football stadium. Were people just keen to kind of have a home anywhere, or was this like, but this isn't Brighton, guys? Where was
Mm.
the fan sentiment on that?
Well, I think that the main opposition came from Lewes District Council, from what I kind of read since, trying to recap around it, because it was approved by government. And the does it count as Brighton? Brighton's kind of sprawled quite a lot. I mean, the old Goldstone was in Hove, which is kind of like the west side. So it wasn't in Brighton proper. Withdean was kind of like kind of north of Preston Park, which is kind of the last stop before you come into Brighton Station. So that again was probably quite central. Was it Brighton proper? Falmouth, Falmouth is the eastern reaches of the city, and it's near the University of Sussex campus, which is very sort of leafy and out there. So I think there was a logistical issue, but actually the Falmouth railway station, which you get if you're coming from town, and by the way, it's included in your ticket, so it's very sort of German style in that regard, so that you get your public transport included, and that's not the case with a lot of cities in the UK. Yeah, so that's kind of like a good local initiative. It's only 3 or 4 stops out of the centre, so it's not like a massive kind of journey. So I think there was a lot of logistics in terms of, because it's right on the main road between Lewes and Brighton, and on match day it can cause quite a bit of congestion around there, as you could expect. But most people will be coming probably from public transport or fan buses, and the fan bus operation is absolutely fantastic. When I go from Tunbridge Wells, which is kind of a town about 20 or 30 miles north, and there's fan buses that run from there. And it's like clockwork. You sort of just get straight in, pull into the sort of car park, which is right by the away end, the south stand, and you go down. Where you arrive like half an hour early, 40 minutes early. If it's a good journey, do your socializing, go to the match, and back to the bus afterwards, and you're away pretty quickly. You have to mix with the away fans on the way back up the steps of the car park, but that's usually okay. It's only if you've got like maybe an obnoxious set of visiting fans, but that hasn't really happened that much, to be honest. So yeah, it's a really good system from that point of view. The challenge is definitely the trains, though. For me, if you as we know from the Arsenal match the other day, the people that leave early can miss the action. But they'll be getting a train, and they'll be back in Brighton a lot of time before everyone else. So it's the queues do build up on that railway. But it's like, as a compact city, but kind of hemmed in by the South Downs. Where would you put it was the problem. So I think that where they have put it is absolutely perfect. Really, it's now an iconic part of the town. It's definitely an asset to the town itself, I think, personally, because it's not just for football, as you've seen. It's women's football as well, it's men's football, and there's also been the Rugby World Cup matches there. So, and it's a conference centre. So it's multi-purpose. It's not just like being used every 2 weeks for football. It's permanently adding value to the area.
I have a little experience of that sort of bus and train system. Not for the football though, for the iconic Lewis bonfire.
Oh yes.
Nights, which I imagine they run the same sort of system of trying to get thousands of people out of Brighton.
Well, Lewis just, is within its own self is worth visiting if anyone's in the area.
Oh, so it's lovely, and they've got one of the great non-league grounds there at Lewis, is in the Dripping Pan.
Dripping Pan, yeah.
Which is just, I mean, a wonderful name and a brilliant stadium. But if anyone's thinking like when could I go, really think about trying to tie it in with a bonfire experience, because I mean, it's one of those. It's hard to explain unless you experience it, but you've got really active. I think they're called bonfire
Yeah.
societies, and they're like football teams. There's like 6 or 7 bonfire societies in the town. They've all got their own kits and colours and traditions. They've got their own grounds within the town of
Hmm.
Lewes. They'll march in, and they'll have their different songs and traditions, and it really is interesting. If you
Mm.
can get, if you can park the very virulent sort of and overt sort of anti-Catholicism of it all, which does jar. I mean, I'm an atheist, but it still jars. Seeing that sort of that sort of thing in sort of a modern day society.
Mm.
If you can park that and just say that's of its time, it's a fantastic experience. But
Hold that thought for Lewis, because I'm actually planning at the end to run through some of the other local clubs that one should take in while one is in the Brighton area. But going back to the sort of AMEX kind of history piece. So we were talking about sort of like the late noughties at this point. So work was then approved by the government, and it began in December 2008. So 2008, 2009 is when Tony Bloom, current owner, comes in and secures the funding for the stadium. And it's only just 2.5 years later, in May 2011, that it's finished and ready. AMEX, I think, came on board a year before that for naming rights. And it started, I think, about 22,000 capacity to start with, obviously with scope to expand, and it's now nearly a third more than that. I think it's like 32 nearly now. I think they just beat their record attendance earlier this season, didn't they? So the first league match, ironically, was versus Doncaster, which you might remember from earlier in the piece was the last match at home that they won to stay up. But unfortunately, the first league defeat at the Amex was to Crystal Palace.
I think that's a nice touch. If I presume that was a request from the club, and the EFL obliged in terms of having Doncaster be, sort of the continuation. I think it is nice when leagues can allow those little nods in to history in the season, and I think that's great. But yeah, talking about we've touched on it a couple of times. So we might as well pick up on this M23 derby.
Don't call it that.
Which are we not allowed to call? See,
No.
I'm very pro M20. That's how I commuted from Reigate to Haywards Heath.
Okay.
Or at least half the way. So I would regularly pre-COVID be on there 4 or 5 days 4 or 5 days a week, and it's a fantastic stretch of motorway with excuse the partridgeness here, but with very limited speed cameras at times.
It's all right that you
it's
get to the sort of
just,
past the back of the Gatwick bit, because obviously that can build up. So
Oh yeah, and one of the best named service stations in the UK. If anyone ever has the delight and honour to stop at Pease Pottage Services, do take that do take that opportunity. But what's the story of Brighton and Crystal Palace? Is it two? I mean, from an outsider, it feels like two clubs looking for a rivalry, and you found each other.
Well, potentially, because I think where Crystal Palace is, for those who are not familiar with the geography of South London, I suppose their nearest rivals would be Charlton and Millwall and AFC Wimbledon, Wimbledon FC as was, and was sharing their ground at some point. But they didn't really have a beef with them. Millwall's more concerned with West Ham, of course. Charlton really have any. I think they're more Gillingham, actually, weirdly, because I've got to share a catchment area, really. So there was no sort of natural rival, I guess, for Palace. And in the 70s, they kind of swapped managers effectively. They had sort of managers at one point. Alan Mullery was at Brighton, Malcolm Allison, and then Terry Venables at Palace. And they had a few fractious matches, and it kind of took off from there. The first bit of crowd trouble that happened at this time, and it's not unusual for the time. Bear in mind, it's the 1970s, and there was a very controversial FA Cup tie with a kind of like missed penalty and all that sort of thing. But they did sort of meet quite a lot at this period because they're mostly sharing the same division. That was usually the second tier. Some more big violence in the mid 80s, and whenever they played, it seemed to swell the attendance. I think kind of gained a notoriety of its own, really, with these flamboyant kind of managers helping to sort of, I'm not saying they're deliberately stoking up tension, but they, because they had controversial fixtures, they obviously then had interviews afterwards that were controversial too. So the in the 90s didn't meet so much because obviously Brighton had gone down quite a bit, and Palace were kind of yo-yo between the Premiership and the Premier League, sorry, I should say, and the Championship. But then when Brighton came back up, they've had since shared a couple of playoff semi-finals. There was a notorious incident in one of them when there was some human excrement found in the visitors' changing rooms. You might remember, and Gus Poyet had something quite a bit to say about that. So it's kind of it has become a strange cultural phenomenon, I guess, of the last 30, 40 years, but it doesn't, despite the fact they didn't play each other for only 4 times over a sort of decade or so, it hasn't lost any of its vehemency. So it's I guess now they're in the Premier League and they're both kind of fairly safe in that division. We're going to see more of it. I went in 2018 to that fixture, and I sat, as I think alluded to earlier, the away fans will sit in the south stand. And by the way, if you're an away fan, the local you'll be served a beer from your area and your end, so to make you feel at home. Whereas the rest of the stand has the wonderful Harveys of Lewis Brewery beer, which will
That is a lovely touch. Perhaps too hospitable.
possibly, and a few clubs do that, I've heard. But it's kind of, at least you kind of know what you're getting, I suppose. You're not having to try anything new,
Heaven forbid you had to try anything new while going on your travels. It'd be awful for you, wouldn't it?
The derby I went to, I shouldn't call it a derby. They're not in the same city. The rivalry the match that I went to, the Palace, Brighton Palace. I took a Finnish friend. It was his first match in England. So he wasn't a friend of mine. He was a friend of mine who's married a Finn. And I sort of met him outside the ground. And it's quite interesting because I've lived in Spain, I've lived in Australia, and all the time I've been, oh, you're just hooligans, blah, blah, blah. And do you know what? In the whole time I've been to watch football since 1986, I've only ever seen one punch thrown and it missed at a football ground in England. And bear in mind, I go to quite a few games each season. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm just saying I haven't seen it. Whereas I've seen full-on riots in Hamburg and Madrid and stuff like that. But and Melbourne, funnily enough. But this particular game and the build-up, there was quite a lot of aggro, and there was definitely. I mean, you don't see that much police presence usually at Brighton. It's very friendly ground. It's a really nice atmosphere. It's as friendly as you get, as hospitable as you get. Home fans don't really, are not reputed for any at all, really. So when Palace came, the police presence was noticeable. It was quite huge, and there was one group that kind of got very vocal, lots of pointing and shouting, and they kind of got escorted away, and I presume they didn't get into the ground, which was like what really worth their travel, really. But that was a fascinating match because Shane Duffy was sent off for a headbutt on Van Aanholt early on, and yet with 10 men, Brighton went with 3-0 up, with some classic great breakaway goal from Florian Andoni at that one, I think Palace pulled one back near the end, so there was sort of a bit of a close finish, but it was, that was noticeably more needle in that game than you would get on, say, a game against Aston Villa or someone like that. So it was that was fun, and it is. But on the whole, as an experience, it's. I mean, I don't think any ground in England really matches the atmosphere you get on a lot of the places on the continent, but compared to a lot of other grounds in the Premiership, there is better acoustics, better generation of atmosphere by the fans. Friendlier songs, less aggro than you do get at a lot of other Premier League grounds. So that's what I would say for the AMEX.
I was going to ask on that in terms of, because Brighton has a sort of a few stereotypes about it. One of it is it's quite a left-wing city. It's got a Green MP, quite a middle-class place and then it's liberal. Some people might even throw around the word woe. Why is Brighton different to other places? You've had to create your own new traditions because it's a new stadium, and maybe that's reflected more modern sensibilities, or maybe some of that politics is bleeding through into the club. You've dedicated a lot of your writing and exploration to the intersection of football and politics, and I just wondered whether you thought the unique politics of the city affect the club or not really in this case.
I think a little bit. I covered Brighton in some regards when in the Defiant, because I wrote about Whitehawk, which is another club within Brighton, and I shall talk about them in a minute. But if we're talking Brighton as a whole, it always has been the escape for like since the Georgian era, which is when it kind of went from being a fishing village to like a big city. This is it attracted royalty and things, so people could get away and be themselves. And it's always been a place where people could be themselves, whether that was, wherever their background. And I think we see that in films like Quadrophenia, which has a whole huge cultural kind of impact on Brighton. If you go there now, Legacy, you see a lot of kind of callbacks to that. But yeah, so it is always been the liberal capital of Britain. And yeah, I guess some of that feeds through to some of the fan base. I mean, not all the fan base comes from Brighton. Remember that, so it's come from other areas of Sussex. But yeah, around there, so I think Whitehawk is definitely I'd say politicised football club fan base in that regard. They're a lot more like your Claptons or your Dulwich Hamlets in terms of a fan base. Whitehawk is not a million miles from Falmouth. It's in the east side as well. And going back to what you said about being quite middle class, I'd say there's actually quite a disparity within Brighton. There's some really nice properties, especially towards Hove, but there's also a lot of harder up areas, including Whitehawk. And but the club within that is, it's done a lot of good stuff for the community. They've got some really friendly, I don't want to say ultras, but fan group. And so yeah, if you're there and then Brighton are playing, say, I don't know, on a Sunday, and you've gone down on a Saturday in Whitehawk or at home, definitely go and check them out. And likewise, Lewis, just a short train ride away, 16 minutes or so. They're the first club in the country to play their men's and women's team the same. They've got those beach huts at the Dripping Pan, as you mentioned as well, walking distance to the station, where it's like about 100 metres from the station. It's a nice little settlement as well, looking over the South Downs. And at the other end of town, you've got Worthing, which is I think it's funded by a former Brighton player, and so they're in the lower sort of leagues, but that's a nice little ground within the residential area, and it gets quite decent fans as well. So there are, and further out, Eastbourne Town, which has again got the sort of the peer pressure ultras, which I should give a shout out to. They had a lot of atmosphere and to the sort of 8th or 9th tier of English football, whoever it is they're in. So it's an eclectic place. Brighton Hove Albion is aware of the club's aware of the town it represents, and and it does a lot of good work within the community as well. So and just on one of those, in terms of supporting local business, as I mentioned, is that the beer that you get there is Harvey's of Lewis, which again, when you're in Lewis, definitely check out the Harvey's brewery if you're into your beer, because there's a wonderful selection. The Sussex Best is my personal favourite, and you can get that at the Ground, and the Albion Ale as well, which they brew for the club. So yeah, they're all round really nice vibe about the place. You certainly know it's very local to where it is. It's got a very clear identity. As you walk around the ground, you'll see, sort of as you would at a lot of grounds, you'll see icons of players from days of yore, like Steve Foster, if those remember, maybe from his Luton Town days when he had a famous sweatband around his head. The 83 FA Cup team, of course, people like Michael Robinson, Mark Lawrenson, of course, who was in the Brighton team in the 80s. So they've got all the icons from the previous eras. They're all around the place, and so it's a club that respects its history, although a lot of it is, like I say, quite recent history in terms of success. But I just think, as an all-round package, it's well run. I mean, they buy good players and they sell them on. Look at Caicedo, look at McAllister. So now we've got great more talent in Mitoma and Ferguson. So it's very exciting times. I think it's very well managed as far as clubs go. And they don't have sort of drama that a lot of other clubs do have. I think the drama days hopefully have gone. As we've alluded to earlier.
You do seem to have a good owner, and someone that I think other clubs, fan bases might bite your hand off to have, in terms of the investment that's been made, but also the kind of the sustainability of the model of Brighton. And I think a lot of people look at you as a club that's sort of built in the right in the right way. Really, it doesn't. It's not overnight success, and it's not. It does seem to have that sustainable foundation, and I can only assume the last few years going to the Amex has just been, better and better and
Mm.
better. And, I'm sure that brings changes as well in terms of, attracting new fans because of the type of football that you've been playing and the higher up the leagues that you're going. But I can't imagine the match day experience has been anything but largely positive for the last few years.
Yeah, I mean, when it's sold out, which it is now, obviously, in your championship, it'd be, you wouldn't be getting the same sort of crowds. But now that it's full, yes, it's you know, buzzing. And the great thing is as well, you see a lot of kids there, you see a lot of women as well. So it is obviously a welcoming environment for everyone, really. And I think it's probably helps make it a nicer atmosphere than you do get a lot of grounds.
Can I ask, and maybe the answer is no anymore, but historically, there was always talk about sort of, I guess, anti-LGBT chanting directed at Brighton fans. Is that something that
Mm.
is still exists as a stereotype?
Oh yeah. It's not a stereotype. It happens. I've heard it. Not so long ago. So it's like it does happen, unfortunately, and it's kind of something that needs to be looked at. Probably doesn't happen as much. I mean, I don't know the stats around it, but anecdotally, within the last 10 years, I've heard it at least 3 times, definitely.
I asked because I hoped that the answer would be no, that's sort of a thing of the past now. But I guess maybe we can take some hope in that it's maybe less frequent than it used to be, or less virulent, or I don't know.
It's certainly more muted. I think crowds nowadays. Anecdotal again. I'm not sure this is fact. I'm just saying anecdotally. I think that's quite good at self-policing. If someone says something, I've seen people pipe in and try to stop it, or people haven't joined in, so they've kind of like faded away rather than caught on as a chant. You know what I mean? So I think it will improve with time, but as you say, it's only recently that male players have actually come out, and statistically, obviously, a certain percentage of Premier League players must be, let's say, LGBTQ plus. So it's not like in the women's game where it's very, very open and people are quite honest and everyone accepts it and moves on. So hopefully that we can get to that level in the men's game as well.
I think it was really good of Brighton as well, being one of the clubs that put themselves forward for the women's Euros. And obviously, I think you had a couple of England games, a couple of Lioness games during that tournament. And when everyone sort of got on board with the women's team and were like, why aren't these games being played at bigger venues? And the FA was just like, well, the bigger venues didn't want us. And I think it reflects well on the club and the city really, and the fans more, that they knew that the fans of the area, whether they be Brighton fans or more general sports fans or fans of other clubs, they knew they would come out and support women's football. I think same, it reflects well on Sheffield United for putting their hand up to host, and all the other clubs that did. And the ones that thought, well, that won't make us any money. I think I hope, they were proved wrong, and I hope they feel a little bit of egg on their face. But did you manage to get to any of the Lionesses games when at the Euros, or?
I didn't, unfortunately. I have been to the Women's World Cup in France, but I wasn't able to go, unfortunately, to the Euros, just to circumstances. But in that Amex game, I think the group match, they beat Norway 8-0.
Yeah.
And then Spain in the quarterfinal with a cracking shot from Beth Mead, who, and I was worried actually, because I thought the World Cup final, I just knew that Spain would be up for revenge, and a much improved team. And they had players back like Putellas, who was their star, who was injured during that Euros, whereas England were missing some key players like Mead, like Williamson, and they didn't quite.
The Spain game in the Euros, they very much took it to us. We were quite fortunate to prevail that night. And
yeah, I don't understand why people weren't talking Spain up more during the World Cup. And then had one defeat in the group stage, but they were. I mean, you've seen this evolve over time. There's parallels with Brighton actually, in that 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 Spain was going to be good at women's football because they've got these massive crowds. Madrid Barca, I think, was a record women's crowd, wasn't it? And they keep the ball on the deck. They've got these these clubs with huge investment, at least at that level. And they've been knocking at the door for a long time. And the same feeling with Brighton in the Championship, you just knew it was going to happen. At some point, you lose so many playoff semi-finals before you can actually get up. So yeah, that feeling, I guess when the planning is right and the investment's right and the talent is there, that eventually you will, kick the door in, really.
And you spectacularly have, you, like I said, we've touched on, you're in the Europa League this year. I guess that's going to be exciting. It's all, and I speak as a Birmingham City fan who we were last in Europe about 12 years ago after we won the League Cup, and we got Club Bruges and Braga and I think Maribor of Slovenia. So not like the biggest European names, but it was just chest out sort of time. We're representing England in Europe, or we're representing ourselves in Europe, and we get to bring them over to our place. What's it going to feel like? Seeing Brighton and Hove Albion, the team that nearly dropped out of the Football League 20 odd years ago, taking on Ajax of Amsterdam.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. So the group is Ajax, Marseille, and Ajax Athens. So I think the yardstick, the sort of measure would be Ajax in terms of, this is a regular, usually Champions League, late stage or knockout stage club. Marseille kind of, I'd say they're kind of nearly at that level, but not quite the same level. So I'd expect, and obviously I'd expect Brighton to beat AEK. But I think the Marseille one will be interesting. And again, Marseille is not we know what happened at Euros. I hope that doesn't happen again in Marseille. The Ajax match will be very interesting. I think that's in terms of on the pitch. That's, I think, will show how Brighton how far they've come, so to speak. And here's the thing: a lot of them haven't played at this level, really. A lot of them come through, like people like Lewis Dunk has been at the club for ages. He hasn't played in Europe, I don't think. So these are, it's going to be a first for someone. Hopefully, you treat it as an adventure, and they'll go out and just do what they do in the Premier League. Really, there's no reason they should fear any of those three teams.
I mean, is the club putting a limit on itself in terms of where it goes from there? Should we be shocked in 3-4 years' time if we see Brighton not in a Europa League group stage but a Champions League group stage?
I don't know. It depends, really. For that to happen, it would need one of the traditional, or two or three of the traditional 5 or 6 that compete for those 4 spots to have a bad season. When Leicester won it, and it's pretty much everyone else was having a bad season, as well as Leicester keeping winning. So I don't want to take anything away from Leicester, but they did keep winning. But at the same time, Man City weren't having a great trot, nor were Chelsea. So I think it's a possibility, but I think the way that Man City and Arsenal, even Spurs look like they might have finally got it together, but obviously it's early season yet. I think it's going to be a long shot. It's not impossible. I wouldn't write it out. I think they will come close. But I think that's the new glass ceiling, really, in terms of I think Europa League is definitely a consistent Europa League is a possibility. Top 4 is going to require really disciplined, consistent performances, and if you're going to lose at home to West Ham, you're not going to qualify for Europe. So you have to I think that's where you're going to have to need to I guess learn to be more consistent in that regard. But they'll get there. They could get there.
I think you've got a tremendous amount of goodwill from a number of people. Like I said, because of the town, a place that a lot of people go to at certain points in their lives, and there's affinity for the town. There's respect for what the club are doing on the pitch and for the model that they have off the pitch. And I think you're a very easy team and fan base to root for, I think, and I think a lot of people are hoping that Brighton continue to have a lot of success in the near future.
Well, it's also a British-owned club, which is increasing rarity, especially in the top flight.
Yes.
And I know I don't want to sound all sort of like little
Go all
Englandery about it.
nationalistic.
No, exactly, because I'm obviously not of that sort of persuasion. But I would say that I feel the Premier League has sold itself a little bit too easily to, to whomever offers the money, so to speak. So I think the more clubs that are locally retained, I think has a more authentic connection with. But I think you're more likely to care more, aren't you, if it's your town, your people, than if you're based somewhere else in the world.
I think that's a fairly astute observation. I can't get you on to talk about the Amex and what a ground jewel it is, without talking about the greatest game in the history of the Amex, which, unfortunately, for anyone who's of a football persuasion, has nothing to do with an 11-a-side game, but it's it's the Rugby World Cup, and it is the Rugby World Cup now happening in France, the ninth edition of the tournament, the 2023 Rugby World Cup. But just 8 years ago, arguably one of the biggest upsets in sport, rather than not just rugby, happened in Brighton. South Africa 32, Japan 34. And I understand from yourself, you had a chance to go to that game and you didn't go.
I didn't go, no. I was like, well, I was really tempted. I saw that fixture, and like probably most people, I'd have gone, oh, that's going to be so one-sided. Because I've seen here's the thing, I've seen a bit like with cricket, I've seen all the test playing nations. It's the same with the cricket. I've seen all the major kind of rugby union playing nations except South Africa. And I was like, oh, shall I go down to that? Oh, I don't know if I can be. Nah, I can't be bothered. So find something else to do that day. But I wish I had. And you were there, right?
I was in North Wales. I was in a house in Llangollen in North Wales, and we were supposed to be having a barbecue. And one by one, the blokes there just caught what was on the telly on the background and just started gathering inside. And then the girls were like, "Where have all the blokes gone?" And they came inside, and they were like, "Oh my god," and we all sat transfixed, and the moment and it's such a brave moment and such a ballsy moment. And I have no problem admitting I thought it was completely wrong at the time. Japan were 3 points down, and they were hammering the South African line, and they got awarded a penalty. If they kicked it, they draw the game. It'd be the greatest result in Japan's history. And they went, "No, we don't want that. We want to win." And they kicked for the corner, and they scored. They ran. They called their best move, and they scored. They scored in the other corner, and it was one of the bravest decisions, like sporting, putting it all on the line. And I just have such admiration for that team. I've written about them in my book, which is as listeners will know, is out. It's called World in Union. It's the history of the Rugby World Cup in 15 matches. Of course, South Africa, Japan at the Amex is one of the 15 matches because of how important that game is in the history of Rugby World Cup. The planning that went into that from Japan, they trained for 2.5 years to beat South Africa. And that was their entire focus. They knew exactly they knew. They didn't have the resources. They didn't have the matchup physically. They came up with a completely different game plan, and we're like, we're gonna change how we play rugby. We're gonna play super fast. We're gonna move the point of attack of the ball. And when push came to shove, they had confidence in themselves to go for the win, and they delivered a great moment for everyone. Now we'll forget that Japan lost 4 days later to Scotland because the World Rugby created an unequal tournament that no smaller nation could possibly win because they had disadvantages. We'll park that for the moment, but just for that opening weekend when we all got to enjoy. I mean, I think everyone does enjoy an underdog turning over one of the great teams.
How is that game remembered in South Africa? Because they obviously won the following tournament, didn't they?
I think it really helped them in the long run. It really shook their complacency. And one of the things they realized is that the racial politics was influencing the team selection in a negative way. If you look at 2015 in South Africa, you only have two black players, and that is 20 years after um, Nelson Mandela, Francois Pienaar in 1995, where which is only a couple of years after apartheid, and you have one black player. If you fast forward to 2019, there's a black captain. The squad, it's not fully, it's not equal, in terms of white and black, but they've managed to integrate many, many more black players, and they're taking advantage of their entire player base now. And they realised that they'd sort of slipped into sort of isolation, and they just, so it was a real wake-up call, and it allowed them to examine what they did, kind of like, I guess, Germany losing 5-1 to England in 2001 in football, and when Germany goes, we need to sort this out, and then they go and put the structures in place that's reboot, and goes and put the structures in place that allow them to win the 2014 World Cup. And without Japan winning, you wouldn't get Sia Khaleesi, a black South African captain, lifting the William Webb Ellis Trophy in Yokohama 4 years ago. So what I think about, in terms of with sport a lot, it can be, you're risking having the worst day of your life by going to a football match on the off, or a rugby match or a cricket match, on the off chance that you're going to have the best day of your life. And it's that trade-off, and why I think sport speaks to so many of us more than, say, theatre or any of the other art forms, really, is because of the unknown that exists in that. And that's a great example. You're right. 99 times out of 100, South Africa win that game, and it's non-eventful. But what about the 1 in 100 chance that we get to experience? And whatever level, whatever sport that is, when you see sort of lightning in a bottle, it's brilliant.
And again, it's AMEX. So it's a multifunctional stadium. It's done men's football, women's football, rugby union, like you said. It's a conference centre. It's within it a great redemptive. What's the word? I'm like Phoenix-like resurrectional story, which every club would like, really. And then so that's why it belongs, like I said, in the pantheon of great modern stadia. And it's not generic. It's got a wonderful design.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Chris. Have you got anything that you particularly want to plug? Any of your books or podcasts or anything coming up that you want to let people know about?
Well, I'm rebooting the podcast. I've taken pretty much nearly a year out because it was just getting a bit too kind of much, really. When you do something for as a hobby and you do it for free. So I'm restarting that again this winter, and I'll be talking about some very diverse topics, including some of the major clubs specific podcasts, and we're looking at some very eclectic places to watch football, such as Thailand. So there'll be that. Anyone's interested in the roots of the game, please read my first book, Origin: Stories of Pioneers Who Took Football to the World. If you're interested in the confluence of football and politics, particularly anti-fascist activity, please read The Defiant: A History of Football Against Fascism. And I am working on a third book right now, but I'm going to keep that under wraps at the moment until I've made sufficient progress to decide whether I want to go forward with it. But I am hoping to have another one out in like 2025.
Oh, fantastic. Well, let's end this call now and see whether you'll tell me off air. But Chris, thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much. And I'm at Outside Right on Twitter and X and Instagram and Facebook. So give us a follow there.
And that is right with a W.
Yeah. So it's play on words for writing. outsideright.co.uk.
He's a clever boy. Chris Lee, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
As I promised, a fantastic interview there with Chris. Please do check out his podcast, Outside Right. Please also check out his fantastic books on the origin stories of the game and the intersection of football and fascism, or more correctly, football and anti-fascism. Some really good writing about football, some really thoughtful writing about football, and I can't recommend Chris's books enough. That's all for this week. Next week is going to be cricket. we're going to be talking to a groundsman from one of the big international venues in England. It's a fantastic chat, and I hope you join us.